Hello, everyone. Are folks seeing my screen? Seeing some nods. Okay, excellent. Thanks for joining. It's a few minutes after 2:30, so we're going to get started here. Thanks for coming to this session entitled Beyond Accommodations, Intentional Design Methods for Improving Validity when Assessing Diverse Populations. I just want to start off by saying that if you didn't just watch Steve Cerisi's presidential address, you got to. It was really fabulous and presented a beautiful vision for assessment, where we're going. And I found it very inspirational, especially in his discussions about equity and fairness. So put it on your to-watch list for sure. The focus of this session, the next 90 minutes, is going to be on 3 approaches for leveraging intentional processes throughout the test development process to minimize the impact of construct irrelevant variance in order to create large-scale assessment solutions that are equitable, accurate, and valid for a wide range of learners. We're going to have 3 presentations. The first by Melissa Golson at ETS, second by Danielle Guzman-Orth at ETS, and then the third will be by Sam Gilbert and myself from CAST. They'll be about 20 to 25 minutes long each, and that'll be followed by Cheryl Lazarus at NCEO, who's going to be our discussant. We're trying hard to leave time at the end of Cheryl's discussant notes for questions and answers. And we have enough participants that I think we really want to use chat for that. So feel free to use chat throughout the presentations, but keep in mind that the presenters are probably not going to be able to look at those chat messages that you post until after their presentation. But we're all going to be doing that after our presentations so that when it comes time for Q&A, we'll have some questions queued up for discussion. And of course, during the Q&A itself, you're free to add chat. All right. Without further ado, I'm going to just queue up Melissa Golson's slides. Her talk is Improving Fairness, Theories of Action and Intentional Design Methods. Just give me a moment here. Okay, here we go, Melissa.
Thanks, Bob. Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be here to talk to you today about theories of action and intentional design methods as it relates to fairness. Could you go forward there, Bob? I just wanted to talk about the pursuit of fairness has played a central role in our educational systems since 1970. And there have been lots of decisions about assessment and how that promotes equitable systems and outcomes for all students. Primarily, when we talk about fairness, one of the things that come to mind are the definitions from the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing in 2004. I'm also today going to incorporate some of those definitions from the U.S. Department of Education's assessment peer review process about what technical requirements are for fairness. Next slide.
Hold on just a moment. All right.
So let's begin talking about the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing in 2004. There was a key chapter to the issue of fairness that gives testimony to the prominence of fairness as one of the 3 fundamental concepts in testing, the 2 others being validity and reliability. And these standards provide us procedures to address fairness across testing processes. It directly explains the design of the test and the development, administration, scoring, and score-based test use. And it gives us, it enters into giving us some investigations about what kinds of things that we have done for fairness, such as looking at test content, about whether or not item content systematically favors or disadvantages some groups of students, and then test contexts such as the testing environment, and test responses such as writing or speaking tasks that might be result in some kind of differences in responses, and then opportunity to learn, which is the extent to which individuals have had exposure to instruction or knowledge that affords them the opportunity to learn. And so that's it in a nutshell, and those are areas that I'm going to go into in just a minute. Next slide. Fairness considerations around test design, test development, administration, and scoring is as outlined in the standards. Basically, fairness is looked at as the validity of test score interpretations for the intended uses in an intended population. So a target population is critical to the construct of fairness. And fairness is part of how we measure whether or not assessments are valid for all populations. Typically, when we think about fairness, everybody in the fairness community and in measurement thinks about accommodations, and I see a lot of work in the research around accommodations and considerations of fairness. I'm going to talk about other aspects of accommodations that may or may not get as much attention today. Fairness also considers safeguards against the inappropriate score interpretation and use. So we know that one of the useful definitions of fairness is that a test should be fair, and if any group differences in performances are derived from construct relevant sources of variance. We know that sometimes there may be group differences, and then how do we examine those differences? And so I want to talk about that here in subsequent slides. Next slide. But there are other definitions of fairness. You know, fairness is often defined as the absence of bias, or fairness reflecting a set of issues, including the larger issues of social equality or social equity. One of the things that we want to think about is when we have our assessments, they usually have a purpose, and then they usually have intended and unintended outcomes that you need to consider. But in the past, we have looked at fairness from the sense of, can we see bias? And bias is a much narrower perspective than is fairness. And it really can distort the interpretation of test scores. Fairness can also be looked at as how the whole testing process, from development and design all the way through to actually score use, is affected, and how different processes within that test design and those uses can impact social outcomes for different groups of students. Next slide. If you are in the K-12 world of assessment development, you will be very familiar with this model. The U.S. Department of Education uses this model as the structure for meeting the technical requirements of an assessment. And you can see here in the middle of the slide, the arrow points to fairness and accessibility. And even though that's in the middle and it looks as though that's a standalone, there's a lot of interaction around how fairness and accessibility play out within the technical critical elements of peer review. So when we are thinking about fairness and accessibility for K-12 assessments, not only are we thinking about the standards, but we also are trying to provide evidence that is going to be collected and submitted to the U.S. Department of Education as evidence of meeting these technical requirements. Next slide. And here's my attempt to talk about peer review and the technical requirements and how fairness interacts. Fairness could be actually viewed along the continuum of critical elements. It's really critical that you would have a wide stakeholder involvement in the standards development in critical element 1, and that would inform the test design and development throughout. And as you can look at the interaction here, I wanted to make sure that you realize that fairness really is interwoven in every component of technical requirements for the U.S. Department of Ed peer review. Although when you look at their model, you don't really see those interaction effects clearly. And so while this model is helpful in understanding how technical requirements are arranged for U.S. Department of Ed peer review, the interaction of fairness and accessibility and how you design those design tests to meet those requirements really are very disjointed. Next slide. On the next slide, critical element 4.2 that I just pointed out about fairness and accessibility under the U.S. Department of Education talks about fairness and accessibility in a very constrained way. First of all, it talks about all state required assessments should be developed to the extent practicable using principles of universal design for learning. That's all that it says about universal design for learning. So there's a varied interpretation in the field and in the testing community about what that really means. And I know that Bob's going to talk a little bit more about universal design in a minute, but I wanted to make sure that you understood how that's a requirement, but that it doesn't have specificity around exactly what those steps are. And then I just wanted to point out that academic content assessments and English language proficiency assessments are held to reasonable and appropriate steps to ensure that assessments are accessible to students and are as fair across the groups, including students with disabilities and English learners, specifically in design, development, and analyses. And sometimes to varying degrees, certain assessments focus more on design, development, or analyses with accessibility. But almost always, if you examine an assessment, sometimes you don't always see that connectivity. So next slide, please. So what is universal design for learning? In the guidance under the U.S. Department of Ed and under the SEA, it says it's a scientifically valid framework and provides flexibilities in ways information is presented, in ways students respond or demonstrate knowledge, and in the way that students are engaged. And it's supposed to reduce barriers in instruction. And so that's pretty much the definition, which you can see doesn't really give you a lot of detail. It's pretty vague in the description. And as most guidance documents are, they're open to interpretation. Next slide. So when we're thinking about fairness in testing, what do? We try to minimize our sources of bias in our testing processes. We look at our administration procedures. We look at the test directions and the directions for administration and try to make sure that we have a standardized test administration. We look at test content, test knowledge selection. We also look at method and ratings or scores and how we're going to do the scoring procedures. Next slide. Basically, we try to minimize the construct of relevant factors during all of these phases of test development, administration, and scoring. And then during score interpretation, we also are supposed to be thinking about these things, but sometimes that test scores, irrespective of whether they're produced by human raters or automated scoring models, they too might have an unequal distribution of differences among subgroups that can be expected, and some kind of bias that might be built into the models, the scoring models themselves. And so when we think about score interpretations, we also know that sometimes there are different versions of tests or test forms that exist in parallel. And so are the test scores comparable? And you know, sometimes we have equating procedures, but we are not always sure about what has been done to ensure that there's no introduction of bias against test takers. And so next slide. And so that brings me to thinking about NCME made a position statement in 2018 and recognized that K-12 testing programs often serve as change agents. Usually we are trying to promote academic achievement and equitable outcomes for learners. And so that position statement really identified components of an assessment system, looked at the intended outcomes, the action mechanisms, and the intended and undesirable outcomes of assessment development. And so a theory of action then can be helpful, not only in planning, but implementing the validation research that has to look at the assessment system. So while theories of action go beyond technical requirements of peer review, they actually can address issues of consequential validity and issues of fairness. They also can provide an important role in the evaluation of fairness in a system. They might also serve as ways to illustrate the articulation of how fairness and the validity argument is made. Next slide. So when you're building a theory, you really want to make sure that you get stakeholders involved. And one of the things that a lot of logic models or theories of change or theories of action, and I'm using those terms interchangeably, but those are about models, they really increase the credibility of your program. And it's more likely that stakeholders then, if they're part of the design, they actually then will support some of the ultimate outcomes that they help select for their system. One of the things is that you want to make sure that you have enough resources and time. And when you're thinking about your theories of action, you want to make sure that you review that with your stakeholders to make sure that everyone's on the same page for the goals of their system. Next slide. Why do we need these models? So we need models because in the assessment world and in the measurement community at large, we know that assessment developers often have the public view that many purposes of our assessments and our scores don't really mean a lot. And sometimes there's a lot of interpretation of scores that result in misuses. And so the measurement profession really needs to take responsibility and think about test use and misuse. And so one of the things that my colleagues, Michael Zicke, had impressed upon me is thinking always not just about what are the purposes and the intents of your assessment design, but actually how those scores might be misused, or what are some of the other outcomes that you might not have intended to your system. So next slide. So how theories of action can help. Theories of action or theories of change can help because they undergird the system. One of the things that you would do with a theory of action is it's a communication tool that helps make clear to the stakeholders and the test developers what it is you're trying to accomplish. For stakeholders, it can help undergird the evaluation plan and the communication plan. And then for test developers, it helps design the test, and it helps in the interpretation and developing the interpretive and the validity argument of the test. Next slide. My colleague and I, Danielle Guzman-Orth, created a theory of action for an alternate English language proficiency assessment system. This theory of action is supposed to support the short and long-term outcomes of a program, and it included a logic model, which was a representation of the program that's visual. And this visual model then would support the evaluation and the validity of the program. Next slide. When you look at this theory of action, you can see there are ultimate outcomes beyond the test itself, so that English learners with significant cognitive disabilities have outcomes that are impacted for long term. Sometimes there are short, intermediate, or long-term outcomes or goals of an assessment design. And those need to be made explicit if those are intended uses or goals that you want to achieve. Many of us, when we develop assessment systems, we don't get into the ultimate outcomes and we only look at the short-term outcomes. For this logic model that you see here, most English language proficiency assessments make decisions about whether or not you would continue or reclassify students in your assessment system, and most programs would stop there and they would not have ultimate outcomes. So in our paper that underlies this, we talk about how important it is to make explicit those outcomes so that you know what the goals of the assessment are. Next slide. So
here you go.
So I wanted to talk about fairness and how fairness is a foundational quality for assessment. And these are overlapping areas on this Venn diagram. And then I wanted to say that anything that weakens fairness also then compromises the validity of a test. So whenever we have issues, we know Kane in 2010 said these are closely connected and that fairness is an essential quality of a test. And that measurement bias must be measured and be part of the validity argument and the test score interpretations, and be thinking about those intended purposes again. So a lot of times in test design and test development, what we see is a disconnect between the actual design and how we are meeting those requirements. Next slide. So I wanted to talk about an argument for fairness in the standards. If you look at the standards, there's great chapters in validity, and we know that reliability has a lot of explicit avenues for us to go down, but there's fewer guidance around the argument around fairness. So I want to think about if we thought about fairness as an argument. I'm not the first person to think about that. Z in 2010 had that same thought and used an analysis, but I wanted to think about how does fairness play out in score-based interpretations and decisions. Next slide.
And you have 5 minutes left, Melissa.
Okay. Yeah, I'm wrapping up here. So if we think about fairness in the standards, and I talked about those areas of test design, administration, and scoring, but now let's think about score interpretations, and more so about the inappropriate score interpretations and intended uses. Next slide. This is a conceptualization of how fairness works in the current K-12 arena, in which we're trying to ultimately create fair and equitable outcomes for learners. Sometimes we actually do some consequential validity studies, but our most short-term outcome in K-12 assessments is the production of a technical report and a peer review submission. Those are not really social, equitable, social justice outcomes or goals. Those are just typical K-12 program goals. Next slide. We often don't see enough about opportunity to learn and how students are able to demonstrate their knowledge, skills, and abilities when we look for evidence around those. We don't know which subgroups that diff analysis were conducted for, and sometimes it's just the basic subgroups that are required. Next slide. And then what are the measurement tools? Usually it's diff, a differential item functioning or differential test functioning. And so those are really critical when you have a high N count, but when you have smaller N counts for alternate assessments, there's not a lot of investigations of bias and fairness. And so we need to think about what kind of a message are we sending when we're really not including methods for how we're addressing fairness for alternate assessments in ways that are similar. And that's not even an explicit request. And next slide. And so I'm arguing that maybe our conceptualization of fairness might need to be adjusted a bit, and that maybe we need to think of fairness as a line of inquiry to support fairness in testing and to develop and broaden our understandings of the standards of fairness and be more explicit. and improve our measurement tools and develop models that would help us investigate issues of fairness. And it's important because, you know, what is the role of consequential validity and fairness? So a lot of times we don't know because we don't investigate fully. And so next slide. I just wanted to say any kind of model that we would develop, like a fairness and testing model that I showed on the subsequent slide, you would have to think about, you know, are we really looking at all the pathways to those ultimate goals? Next slide. In revisiting the standards for fairness, I want to say the standards provide general principles, but no relevant empirical or methodological exemplars for practice, and that they could be enhanced by focusing and expanding on issues of fairness. I want to say that we need models to evaluate fairness, and that we need to organize our fairness argument framework so that we can examine beyond those traditional, which we should do, but we need to go beyond those traditional fairness standards. One of the reasons is there's a huge disparity between the standards recommendations and practice. Next slide.
And just one more minute for you, Melissa.
Okay. I hope to create a debate on fairness within the people here and in the measurement community to think about how the use of tests influence potential unfairness, how we need to become more attuned to our own implicit cultural biases, how we can make discussions about fairness and accessibility part and as important as issues of validity and reliability in the testing community. And last, future discussions on the last slide.
Just a moment.
I'd like to pose some questions for you. As we move forward with thinking about the future of fairness, I want to think about, do we have the methods we need? Have we really looked at all the plausible causes for disparities? How can we think about subgroups and question whether or not subgroups should be discrete categories at all? And how could we model more intersectionality so that we are not biased against creating and further replicating deficit narratives such as the racism and disabilityism that occurs often and creates and promotes a deficit thinking. So what are our ultimate outcomes for supporting standards of fairness, and have we articulated our goals in a way that makes sense? Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Fabulous talk. I love your big picture look at fairness. It's wonderful. All right, our next speaker is Danielle Guzmanoff from ETS. She'll be speaking about equitable assessment through twinning. And just give me a moment here to share that.
Perfect. Thank you, Bob. So as Bob said, my name is Danielle Guzman-Orth, and I am a research scientist at ETS with Melissa Golson and others that I see here who have joined us for this talk today. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time out of your schedule to join us and try to push the envelope, push the field further on these topics. Today, I'm going to share a little bit about our implementation or our vision for equitable assessment, fair assessment, through an application we call twinning. And I think in this work, you'll see a lot of similarities with what Melissa just presented and what Bob is going to share with us as well. So next slide, please. So just as a quick overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about the intersections and applications. And when we think about applying all of these guidelines and guidance standards in actual practice, talk a little bit about challenges and opportunities, and share a few examples from one of the research projects we've conducted here at ETS. Next slide. And before we jump in, I think it's just really critical to note, as Melissa was talking about the diversity, especially in the K-12 environment today, we have incredibly diverse classrooms, but there is a common goal, which is to provide our students with really inclusive and equitable learning and assessment experiences. Next slide. So when we think about fairness in assessment, now I'm not going to go into this because Melissa did an excellent job providing us with this conceptual overview, but these quotations in particular stand out to me when we take a look at the standards. So here we start seeing references to universal design and acknowledgement that, but even when universal design is applied, there may be situations where the test is not appropriate for all test takers. Therefore, some test adaptations may be needed. And so this is where the concept of these test adaptations are introduced for our special population students. Next slide. So when we really think about applying all of this, so the intersection of our fairness considerations and how this intersects with universal design, this also intersects very clearly with accessibility. When we talk about accessibility, we're really thinking about the interaction effects, if you will, between the characteristics of our test takers and the item itself or the entire test that they're taking. And really, when we are talking about accessibility, we want to maintain the reliability and validity of the test score inferences. We want to know what our students know and are able to do. We don't want to know, we don't want to measure their disability in this case. Next slide. So here's an example of some of these construct-irrelevant barriers that might emerge when we think about accessibility. There's physical considerations, linguistic, cognitive, sensory, perceptive, emotive. Any of these things can work in isolation or in tandem with one another to impact accessibility for students. Next slide. This isn't lost on the field, though. There's lots of guidelines to promote accessibility and put it into practice. We have our standards. When we start looking at our special populations, we also have guidelines from those special interest groups. We, as was stated earlier, we have universal design guidelines for learning as well as for assessment. We have a plethora of accessibility and accommodations tools that are available for students when taking high stakes assessments. And nowadays, these are really starting to be organized in more of these multi-tiered conceptual models, which I think are really important for this topic moving forward. So I'll show you an example of this in a bit. Additionally, though, while we have all of these guidelines and these best practices, there's still this practice, if you will, in the field for omitting test items or entire test domains when content still cannot be made accessible even through all of this information that's available in practice. Next slide. So this is an example of a multi-tiered conceptual model. This is from Smarter Balanced. Now, mind you, I'm not speaking directly about Smarter Balanced today, just showing this as an example of these 3 tiers that are really permeating all of these conceptual models across a lot of our K-12 testing programs today. We have overall tier of universal tools. These are accessibility resources that are available for all students. We have designated supports, which are available for a smaller group of students. And then we have our accommodations, which are available to students with a designated need, such as an IEP or a Section 504 plan. One other key thing to point out here as we look at this conceptual model, there is a consistent pattern that we see across each of these tiers. And that's the breakdown of these resources that are embedded into the testing platform or non-embedded, so elements that are external to the testing platform. And this is an important component to keep in mind as we continue throughout this presentation. Next slide. So, our students who are blind or have low vision, this is a particular group of students that we are working with a lot at ETS. In particular, as Melissa mentioned, when we think about our disability student groups, what is our unit of analysis, so to speak? Are we looking at students with disabilities in general, or do we want to narrow the focus a bit more? So when we think about our students who are blind or have low vision, our BLB students, this is an incredibly diverse group of students. And these students can vary in their visual acuity and light perception in age of onset, so whether they've experienced congenital blindness, blindness from birth, or whether they've had late onset blindness, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of this variation has the potential to impact not only the individual disability presentation in the student, but how they have experienced the physical world around them. And this is really important because our students who are congenitally blind and such may have a more limited understanding or more nuanced understanding of their interactions with the physical world or complex phenomena. So this is an important concept. We'll revisit this moving forward. Next slide. So when we think about the application, so moving fairness and universal design and accessibility to our students and making content accessible, we do run into a couple of challenges that are important to note. Some of them are in regards to these interactions, the intersections between content, disability, and accommodation. And we see this often nowadays in regards to science content that is aligned to the next generation science standards, where a few of these concepts, particularly complex abstract phenomena, may benefit from having some sensory knowledge. And this, I think, is really keenly illustrated in the next slide, where here we have a performance expectation where students are required to develop a model to describe that light reflecting from objects and entering into the eye allows objects to be seen. So this is an example of one particular performance expectation where here we have no issue with students needing to develop a model. It's more so the way that the performance expectation is worded. It does pose significant challenges for our students who are blind or have low vision. Next slide. So that brings us to another challenge here. When we start tackling this more complex abstract phenomena and trying to write test items that measure this complex phenomena, we often start leaning towards more assessment innovations. So this can be seen in the broader use of animations or simulations, visual-based representations of concepts, or interactive item types like matching items. Drag and drop is another way to think of those. And all of these are available with the technological advances as well in the move to computer-based assessments. But the thing to remember for our blind and low vision students is that there are few to no comparable accessible implementations for students who are totally reliant on screen readers. For example, when it comes to drag and drop. Or in the case of simulations, while there are some accessible simulations available in the field, then it becomes a question of, have all of our students had the opportunity to learn how to interact with these accessible versions of the simulations? So that raises an equity issue. So next slide. So when we think about exposure and access and opportunity, we do see some challenges in regards to the variability and accommodations for our blind low vision students, particularly in regard to accommodation familiarity, students' perceived usefulness of the accommodations, as well as their preference. And this is a point I also want to highlight here, because when we think about our diverse range of students, including our students with low vision, some of these students may be dual media users. What this means is that they use print and Braille. So they need the opportunity to be able to strategically self-select which resource they want to use when they want to use it. And so this strategic self-selection will depend on a variety of personal characteristics, such as time of day, lighting in the room, eye fatigue, et cetera, et cetera. So this concept of preference and choice is really important to keep in mind. Next slide. So we like to reframe these challenges as opportunities. When we think about designing, implementing universal design and assessments, we like to think of implementing multifaceted accessibility solutions. So these accessibility resources, these accommodations are not discrete. They do not work they do not work alone. They work in tandem with one another. They work in concert. And we use combinations of these support strategies to promote access for our students. Next slide. So this sort of exploration was housed within a multi-year project at ETS, where we were building foundational evidence to promote inclusive science assessment opportunities for our blind and low vision students. Really, in this work, we're looking to increase inclusion, access, and opportunity, and figure out ways to minimize the likelihood that our students would be excluded, or minimize the likelihood that they would have to omit content, minimize the likelihood that they would have to take separate assessments, particularly thinking of our dual media users who use both Braille and print access. Next slide. One of the ways in which we try to implement this is through designing born accessible content. Now, there are a few different approaches to do this, and here I'm only speaking to one approach, twinning. So twinning is a very disciplined multi-step process to revise existing item types that are not born accessible and that cannot be made sufficiently accessible with a standalone accommodation, such as Braille or tactographic or audio support through screen reader, things like that. So by adding these multifaceted accessibility solutions to these items and creating twins, we have a range of accessible implementations that are ranging in as far as the intensity and how much we have to make accessible. So there's a continuum here that we're really talking about. So not all twins are created equal. Next slide. And so we'll see that as we move into this current study, where some of the twins that I'll show do look more like the original item and some might look a little bit more different. And again, that's part of implementing the variety and the accessibility resources here. Next slide. So in this current study, we really tried to unpack standard 3.2 as it exists in the standards, particularly the part where it calls attention to designing tests that measure the intended construct and minimizing the likelihood of barriers from construct irrelevant characteristics. Next slide. So revisiting this again, this performance expectation again, in the context of this project, we weren't tackling these performance expectations, if you will, in the sense that we're trying to change them. Instead, we're asking the questions, what can we do? Or what else can we do? So thinking of those multi-tiered conceptual models where all of these resources already exist, what else can we do to make this complex abstract phenomena more comprehensible for our students who are blind? So next slide. That brings us to the partnership that we have developed with WestEd, where in the context of this partnership, we sort of tackled this opportunity in this research setting to explore alternative means of representation for this complex abstract phenomena, relying on more multisensory access methods that are typically more familiar for our blind and low vision students. We also sought to minimize the need for technology and through that maximize the likelihood that our students may be familiar with some of the access methods we're sharing. Next slide. So before I move into the examples to share, I do want to note that these are targeting Earth space science, and essentially students in this performance expectation, students are required to develop and use a model of the Earth, Sun, Moon system to describe the cyclic patterns of lunar phases, eclipses of the sun, moon, and seasons. So there's a lot there. We're talking about eclipses, we're talking about, planetary bodies, things that our blind and low vision students have not, and also our sighted students have not had an opportunity to physically touch and interact with themselves. However, our sighted students are able to see these complex graphics I will share in just a minute. I do want to also note that I'm not sharing this whole item set. This is a very complex set of items that go together to measure this very complex performance expectation. I'm only sharing a subset. And for the purposes of time, I'm also not sharing the ancillary materials that go with these twins, such as the test administrator scripts, gestural directions, or scoring considerations. And I do want to note that, again, this is early work and these twins are in the early prototype stage. So next slide. And it's also important to note and give credit where credit is due. The TEIs, the technology enhanced items, were designed by our content partners with WestEd for their client, the Louisiana Department of Education. And my team here at ETS, we created the twinned versions. So next slide. Here's an example of some of the complex graphics we could see in trying to measure this performance expectation. So figure 3 shows the tilt of the moon's orbit around the Earth. We see that there's the Earth, there's the moon, there's a segment of the Earth's orbit, there's the moon's orbit, and the moon's orbit is at a 5-degree tilt. So just in my language-based explanation there of the graphic, there's a lot. If we were to totally rely on a language-based explanation, as we typically do when adding alt text or long descriptions to graphics, that has potential to increase the cognitive load for our students, which sort of defeats the purpose of having that accommodation support there for them in the first place. We want to make sure that our accommodations are accessible and they don't increase that cognitive load. In the bottom graphic, figure 4, we see the inner solar system. So this is sort of a cross-cutting aerial view of the solar system and all the planetary bodies and where they are in relation to one another. Next slide. So to make this accessible, what we did, so this is just figure 3, the tilt of the moon's orbit around the Earth. We tried both 2D and 3D models. In our internal testing, 3D models were clearly the front runner. And that is because of the spatially charged comparative language that's needed to really interpret what it means to have a tilt in the moon's orbit compared to the Earth's orbit, and so on and so forth. To really elicit that concept of a tilt required something more along the lines of this 3D models. Next slide. Now, this is a little bit different. For figure 4, on the left, we have what we call our low-tech version. So this was made with materials that can be commonly found in any K-12 classroom. I think these are styrofoam balls that we put on top of metal rings. On the right-hand side, we did use some technology here. So this is a tactile graphic. And if we go back to those multi-tiered conceptual models, embossing is allowed. We're able to use tactile graphics, but this is a different style of tactile graphic that isn't currently supported on our high-stakes standardized assessments. So this style of tactile graphic affords a different sensory experience for our students who are blind or have low vision. It adds color. It adds the Braille labels. And so the combination of all of these resources in this PIAF, picture in a flash tactile graphic, provides more types of opportunities for our students to experience and gain access to the content. Next slide. Here's an example of a common item type we like to use in K-12 computer-based assessments, and that's a drag and drop. There's a lot of cognitive affordances that arise when we use drag and drops for sighted students. For our students who are reliant on screen readers, there isn't yet an accessible implementation for a drag and drop item. So this item would either have to be changed to a different item type or omitted for the student who is blind and uses a screen reader. But we still want to make sure we can test this content. So next slide. So these are a couple of ways that we developed that still afford us the opportunity to test the content. On the left, we have, again, sort of our low-tech version using the construction paper, and these are fuzzy pom-poms, different sizes that, again, provide a different sensory experience. And those white labels on the upper right, those are sort of Velcro stickies that the student can use as the drop bays to figure out where to drop their pom-pom in the correct space. On the right, we created a very similar model using the pee-off paper, using the pee-off machine. So this, again, provides a different sensory experience for our tactile graphic users. And those black boxes in the upper right are magnets. And the reason why I point these out is that it's very important when you're working with a student who is blind or low vision. They experience everything through their senses, through touch. And so once they drop those draggers in the correct bay, we want to make sure they can stay there, so that way their test examiner can record the response for them. That's pretty critical. We don't want anything to be bumped and moved out of place. So again, just thinking along the lines of what might we need if we want to actually figure out how to apply this in an assessment perspective. Next slide. Here's another example. So as Bob is bringing that up again, that visual was another example of the solar system. Essentially what it is, it's the sun in the middle with the Earth's orbit around it. And the Earth's orbit shows the Earth with the moon and the moon's orbit going around the Earth at 4 different positions. And what the student is supposed to do is use that to interpret and explain the sun and the moon eclipses. So I'll just pause here a moment so you can see that the Earth is at the 4 different positions. Next slide. So here is a way that we were able to represent this tactily. Again, on the left, our low-tech version, and on the right, we were able to, again, through the pee-off machine, create a different tactile experience where we have the solid black line that has a different weight and different texture compared to the dotted line. So it's very sensory distinct between the Earth's orbit and the moon's orbit. And this is important to point out. So I've already mentioned color and braille labels and things like that, but these different sensory experiences, tactile experiences, are very important, particularly when we think of the range of our students who are going to be interacting with these graphics. Everybody is at different levels for their braille literacy and their sensory experiences. So having this option through the pee-off paper is an important consideration. Next slide.
And just 1 more minute left, Danielle.
Mm-hmm. So to wrap up, we bring up all of these considerations because, I mean, as Melissa noted very clearly, there's variations in interpretation for universal design and how to create accessible assessments and actually apply those in the K-12 field. And so what we shared with you today, we hope is just one glimpse of where we may sort of push the envelope, so to speak, on universal design, how it's been traditionally applied, and say, is that enough? Can we do more? And this is where we think using something like inclusive designs, so accommodating preference and choice within the types of tactile graphics, may help to better achieve a more robust implementation of universal design and better maximize access. With that, however, we do recommend future directions for research, such as enhanced guidelines and enhanced research studies to better support these practices, to ultimately ensure that the resulting outcome has those long-term effects, as Melissa noted, that we ensure that students are able to show what they know and are able to do, and we're able to use their test scores appropriately to inform decision-making. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Fabulous talk. All right, next up will be Sam Gilbert and myself from CAST. Our talk is Applying Universal Design Principles to the Accessible Test Development Process. Just give me a moment here while I wrestle Zoom into compliance with my wishes. Wish me luck. All right, I hope folks are seeing my slides now. Sam and I are going to be sharing the stage for this talk today. So we're going to be talking, UDL came up in Melissa and Danielle's talks, and I'm glad it did, because we're going to be digging a lot deeper into UDL, what it is, and a bit of its history in application to assessment, and talk about some of the current efforts to bring past efforts forward into the next decades. So we're going to start off with a poll question. Because UDL, Universal Design for Learning, came up so much, we're going to ask what folks know about it. So I'm going to turn on a poll here, and you should all see it now. Wait, let me relaunch it. There we go. So kind of a Likert scale there. Give folks a few moments to indicate what they know about Universal Design for Learning. And I'm going to use the popcorn method for knowing when to stop the poll. When it sounds like there's only a few kernels left in the pot, but before you burn it. Got about 15 responses. Open for a few more. Anyone else? Going once? Going twice? All right. We've got 5. Never heard of it. 5 have a basic idea. 5 have a solid understanding. I was hoping somebody was gonna pick one of the last 2 choices and perhaps could come up on the stage with us. Yeah, this is really typical. There's a lot of confusion about Universal Design for Learning, what it is, and we're gonna hope in this very brief presentation to give you an overview. Oh, now I'm sharing the results. Sorry, I wasn't sharing it earlier. There we go, the results. All right, so Sam's gonna take us through a little bit of the history of UDL and assessment. Take it away, Sam.
All righty, thank you so much, Bob. And again, we're gonna cover a little bit about, well, a lot of it about UDL and assessment in our session. And you've heard about it before, but we're gonna just get into how the role that assessment and UDL play with one another in our next steps. So next slide, please. All right, so Universal Design for Learning has been directly written into federal legislation on curriculum and classroom instruction, most recently in the reauthorization of the Perkins Act, which is this first legislative document up here in 2018. This is in addition to other requirements specifically addressing accessibility, such as those espoused by Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, as well as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, of course. So for more information, you can click on the QR code on the bottom. It is a clickable link, and you can learn more about UDL in public policy and legislation. Next slide, please. And there has been an increasing body of research evidence supporting UDL's efficacy for diverse learners, including those with disabilities. And I also want to take a note that UDL has been noted to be particularly effective in online and blended environments. Of course, everyone's been thinking about that just with the nature of what's going on in today's world. So I thought it'd be good to mention that. Next slide. But why do we really need UDL given these other accessibility guidelines? We have WCAG, we have 508, we have all this different stuff. And we have access to content and interfaces through that. Yeah, and that is very, very necessary. But addressing accessibility alone is not sufficient. It's not enough. And so students need access to opportunities to learn and to demonstrate learning. That's the golden piece right there. We're thinking about accessibility on that level too, of opportunities to learn and demonstrate learning. It's important to note that UDL is predicated on a foundation of basic accessibility and in no way attempts to replace existing accessible design elements. It just tries to push this to this other level. Next slide, please. All right, so I've been talking about these UDL guidelines. What are these things? Well, here they are on your right. UDL arises from cognitive and neuroscientific research on learning over the past few decades. The UDL guidelines are based upon individual variation in the three set of networks governing learning: affective, recognition, and strategic, as you can see here by these three columns. From these three networks, 9 specific guidelines are defined. That's each of these boxes. Wonderful job. Thank you, Bob. Specifically, to support differences in learners' recognition networks, for example, which is this middle column, they should be provided with multiple means of representation through options for perception, language and symbols, and comprehension. If we're talking about supporting our learners' engagement or affective networks, they should be provided with multiple means of engagement through recruiting interest, for sustaining effort and persistence, and for self-regulation. And lastly, to support differences in learners' strategic networks, or their action and expression, they should be provided with multiple means of action and expression through options for physical action, through options for expression and communication, and lastly, options for executive functions. Within each guideline are specific checkpoints to be applied during the creation of standards, instruction, materials, and assessment. I'm just going to give a quick pause because I know that that's a lot, especially if you're new to UDL. You may have heard of universal design, but may be new to universal design for learning. One of the central tenets of universal design, from which UDL is derived, is to design proactively for the widest range of users to avoid retrofitting and minimize what we would call in the assessment world contract irrelevant barriers, as you've been hearing today. Next slide.
Whoops. Hold on.
Those are the UDL guidelines, in case you're interested in more information.
All right, so I want to talk a little bit about, bring this over to the assessment realm and computer-based testing. There's a double-edged sword here that we need to address. These digital technologies can be wielded in wonderful ways. For example, we can develop instruments that assess students to deeper levels of knowledge and skill and understandings, and on constructs that are just really tricky to measure using traditional paper-based tests. And also, and as we were hearing from previous speakers, there's an opportunity to incorporate tools and interfaces that improve the accessibility for students, including those with disabilities, by allowing transformation of content and providing flexible response options. But if we bring a retrofit mindset to the use of technology, so if we have the paper-based testing, traditional testing model in mind, and we bring that mindset to the use of technology, we're not going to fully enable all of these supports for students. And furthermore, some of these novel interfaces, especially those that come from technology-enhanced items, can introduce new accessibility barriers and new sources of construct-irrelevant variance. So how do we do it right? It's really important that we design accessible online solutions with a grounded understanding of students' diverse abilities, both construct-relevant and construct-irrelevant, and the ways that the students interact with the test items and the tasks we're presenting them. And we need to have a thorough consideration of the factors impacting construct validity, with an emphasis on identifying and reducing sources of construct-irrelevant variance. So this is where we started applying the Universal Design for Learning framework, which has been around now since the 80s. A peer-cast collaboration in the mid-2000s generated a framework and guidelines for applying UDL in assessment, for large-scale assessment, and these have more recently been updated. Really quickly, what this framework, the essential elements of this framework are 2 components. One is these categories of student processing abilities, which is basically an embodiment of the UDL guidelines, and task components. So different aspects of the specific task or test or items that we're presenting to the students. And we're looking at an intersection of those. So for each task component, consider the different ways in which students would use them. So that's a lot to take on. Let me give you an example here. This is just a an abridged version of a summary page from the guidelines themselves. If we look, for example, at perceptual processing, the second column here is sources of variance. So visual ability, visual acuity, visual processing skills, knowledge of graphic conventions, motoric might be navigation of animation or video. So this is all pertaining to a video animation component within a task. So the way we intend these to be used is that if the item designer or the task developer or the task template developer looks at the task, looks at this component in the task and asks themselves, is this item intending to measure, for example, visual acuity? Is that an intended construct? If not, here are some design considerations to keep in mind to avoid measurement of unintended constructs. Flexible image size, zoom. We give this flexibility to the student so that we're going to reduce construct irrelevant variance. If, on the other hand, you're designing, an example actually that Steve Cerisi mentioned, if you're designing a Snellen acuity test and visual acuity is construct relevant, then don't apply these design considerations because you're going to stomp on your intended constructs. Okay, so the idea here is to support a critical evaluation of the elements of a task, to identify potential sources of construct irrelevant variance in a systematic way and consider appropriate design options. And this goes beyond basic accessibility, since accessibility guidelines don't address variance, for example, in students' executive function skills and affective processing. So these processing abilities here, these are the 6. Now this was what we had in the UDL guidelines at that time. UDL has since been developed out to have the 9 guidelines that Sam just showed you. And here's just a list of the task components. These are types of stimuli, types of interactions, types of task designs, right? And again, it's the intersection of these two that's used as the loci for applying these guidelines. Further efforts to support intentional design of accessible assessments was accomplished in a 4-year IES-funded project, extending the Universal Design for Computer-Based Testing Guidelines effort into evidence-centered design approaches as implemented through the PADI system. Here, UDL was specifically woven in by adding UDL design considerations to what's known in PADI parlance as the additional KSAs, or the additional knowledge, skills, and abilities. Again, further defining the explicit processes by which we consider the Universal Design for Learning guidelines. Despite these efforts, much work remains. Though we believe UDL can play a critical role in the development of accessible, fair, and accurate assessments, and it's written into some legislation, it hasn't made a lot of impact yet. And we see 4 major challenges being responsible for that. One is the general usability of the guidelines, which is a 170 odd page tome right now. It's not very usable. It's also designed for a very limited set of stakeholders, really just, again, item developers and designers, task template developers and designers in large scale assessment. There's also, as I mentioned, a misalignment with the UDL guidelines as they've developed. And there's lack of a systemic view of equity. We're just looking at the item level at questions of fairness and equity, which isn't enough. So as part of the iSmart Enhanced Assessment Grant led by Maryland, and which the DLM folks at the University of Kansas and CAST are partnering with support for evaluation from BYC Consulting, we've been doing some deep application of UDL to the design of these tasks. This is an example of a task where design stage of a task for students without significant cognitive disabilities, but who are still struggling in science. So we've been applying UDL guidelines and realizing, wow, this is really hard. We're well-versed, we're seeped in UDL. I've been doing this stuff for 20 years, and I'm still finding it hard to do. So one of the processes we're doing right now is aligning the framework, as I said, trying to figure out how to best take the 6 categories of processing and align those to the 9 that exist in UDL right now. We're pretty much done with that process. We're also decomposing the entire UDL and UDCBT guidelines, taking them apart down to the core and then matching them up using some very flexible databasing, collaborative databasing tools. And Sam's going to talk a little bit about some other approaches that we're applying to the process.
Thanks, Bob. All right, so applying accessibility and UDL considerations during assessment design can be, as Bob mentioned, an overwhelming cognitive task for any test developer and for teachers, really for anyone. So we're starting to think out of the box and apply what we know about the importance of providing users with both executive function supports and options. For example, we're playing with the database tools from the previous slide to allow users to slice through what is essentially a multidimensional space of technologies, item types, constructs, and student variability in such a way that supports designers' needs. We've also been looking at how other industries, for example, LEEDs, which stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, and how they handle complex design and compliance standards. For example, by supporting users in keeping track of what needs to be done, what has been done, and what remains, such as through the creation of dashboards. Next slide. Okay, so we just talked about how the UDL guidelines have been updating over time. And of course, there's going to be in the upcoming years, another revision of the UDL guidelines for our 3.0 edition. Right now, UDL implicitly looks at equity. And I mean implicitly. Whereas UDL 3.0, our up and coming version, really wants to look at equity very, very explicitly. So for example, we need to go beyond accommodations to consider the role of equity in the test development process, for example, and furthermore, whose voices are being heard, who is not being included, why are these people not being included? This obviously includes a broader set of stakeholders than just test designers. Whereas the UDL guidelines and the UDCVT guidelines, they both strive to minimize barriers on an individual level. UDL 3.0, or this next iteration of the guidelines, we hope that it will address barriers that might be related to one's identity, as well as systemic barriers, such as the institutional, systemic, and cultural barriers that exist in our everyday lives. We predict that this process of expanding the UDL guidelines to continue a focus on equity and this equity-centered approach will positively impact the way that we design, develop, and administer assessments that are accessible, valid, and fair. So stay tuned. Next slide.
So next steps. Well, the next step is to do what we thought we'd already do, but were interrupted by COVID-19. We were planning to have results to share with you today from initial design evaluations by stakeholders. We have a number of interface design ideas that we want to put in front of stakeholders, ideally leading to co-design activities, which is something that we commonly do with students and teachers. If you're interested in being part of these evaluations, please contact us. Also, we started exploring how to best support educators in applying UDL to classroom assessment creation. Now, to some extent, this has already been a focus of the UDL training and support efforts for the last 20+ years, since it lies right at the intersection of assessment and instruction. But we want to better support teachers in improving their application of universal design for learning and coming up with assessments, and especially in terms of handling new interfaces, new technologies, and including technology-enhanced items. A final note is that the UDL Implementation and Research Network, which is a grassroots organization that supports scaled implementation and research related to UDL, we're going to be starting a new special interest group specifically on assessment. If you're interested in being part of this effort or interested in the UDL IRN network in any way, you should know that there's no cost to be part of the network. And if you are specifically interested in being involved in this forming special interest group on assessment, please contact myself or Caroline Tussis at ETS. And with that, I'd like to close. So we have a good amount of time for Cheryl to serve as discussant. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Bob. Let me share my screen. Just a second here. Okay. And while I'm getting that up and going, please put some questions. I know that you're all probably have lots of thoughts, and I know my mind is just bubbling with lots of ideas, so many things as we really think about the future. I went back to the title of this session, which was Beyond Accommodations, and really thinking intentionally about how to improve assessments. And this is such a important time to be really thinking about that, as there's just so much happening right now, you know, with the distance learning, the hybrid education. Everyone's trying to figure out things, you know, questions about how do you make decisions for instruction and the need for that data. And it's just so important for us to really be stepping back, like this session is, to really be thinking about, but how can we develop assessments that are accessible to diverse populations? And I think historically, and people still say it to me, I've heard people say this to me within the last month, you know, it's like, well, there's so much going on. We'll figure it out for some kids, for the kids with disabilities, for the English learners, the ones that are more complex, we'll figure that out someday. We've just got to rush ahead and figure out how to get data that we can use right now for most kids. And that just leads to so many problems that don't need to happen. And so just thinking about really, how can we best access these kids, all students, including diverse populations? I think Melissa in her session had the NCME position statement and a line in that that said, K-12 testing programs can often serve as change agents. And I think that continues to be true, just as it historically has been. And then Danielle, in her presentation, one of her bullets said, items are not born accessible. So really thinking through how to make items that are accessible to a diverse group of students. Melissa also talked a bit about the vital role of theories of action, and that theories of action that really are helpful and are useful to a wide range of audiences, involve stakeholders in the development and the review of those theories of action, because there's always that big possibility of scores being used or interpreted inappropriately. And if we get the stakeholders involved right from the get-go, that can really help reduce some of those problems. UDL clearly has a vital role in ensuring that assessments items are as accessible as possible for diverse group of students, including those with disabilities, English learners, so on. And then, of course, we can't forget all of those principles that provide so much guidance and the standards for educational and psychological testing, the critical elements in the peer review, the NCME position statement, so on. There's, and I believe this was from Melissa again, that sweet spot where, you know, reliability, validity, fairness, where they all overlap, but I don't know, that the devil's in the details. So I know then, I found it really interesting to listen to Danielle as she presented her session on the twinning example for blind or low vision students, and gave us a really good reminder, which I think too often we forget, is just how that there can be federal categories of students with disabilities. It's easy to categorize individuals, but the reality is it's a very diverse group of students. Blind, low vision students are very diverse, and you could take any of those disability categories and there would be lots and lots of diversity there. So really thinking not only of the characteristics of the test taker, but also just what are the needs of each individual student and how to provide equitable experiences. I know I really enjoyed just looking and having the opportunity to see the great examples of accessible items, what they might look like, and think there's some real potential there for use in the future. One question I had, and maybe she'll tell me, is just about cost issues that I know I've worked a bit with someone in not the state that Danielle was working with, but another state where someone is worried and very concerned about, just the cost of some of the manipulatives that are needed for blind, low vision with many of the assessments. And so I was wondering, do some of these items, are they less expensive to produce than others, or just what are the implications there? And then I totally enjoyed Bob and Sam's presentation and thinking about UDL and relationship to digital technologies. It was a good reminder about how many wonderful opportunities digital technologies can provide us for really innovative items that better assess what students know and can do. But they also reminded us that it really can introduce some new issues, and how can we deal with that, and thinking through UDL within the universal design computer-based testing framework guidelines, that they really have been doing some deep thinking, they and their colleagues, about just some of those considerations and how to move more towards an equity centered approach, and that it probably isn't just items, but it's a more systemic way of thinking about it. And I'm looking forward to seeing, what is it, version 3 when it comes out in the future. Clearly has a role as we move beyond accommodations. And then I'm gonna go back to, and not gonna go through all of these because I want to leave a few minutes for questions. It's kind of, I found the questions that Melissa ended her presentation with things that I really wanted to grapple with, things that I just wanted to have a half-hour conversation about almost every single one of these questions. And I think they're really good questions for us all to consider. Some questions that are useful as we think about policy, research, or other research that we might be doing in the future. So we'll just, I'll leave it at that and open it up to any questions.
Thanks, Cheryl. If the group is small enough that if folks want to unmute themselves and speak, we can do that. Sam, I know you had a question.
Well, I definitely have a question. I don't know if it's fully formed yet, but Danielle, your presentation really got me thinking about the messiness of accessibility. I don't know if that's the proper terms that I should be using, but when you were mentioning, for example, that one student may be using dual media and how to navigate that. How did you and your team come about these approaches and really start to focus on, say, dual media and these multiple approaches that a given student could take? Does that make sense?
Right, right. I think that's a great question. Well, my background is in special education, so I've spent all my time before ETS, well, at ETS, working with students with disabilities. Specifically, my area of interest is English learners with disabilities. So I'm very accustomed to the complexities, if you will, in trying to find access methods that really truly work for students with the most complex needs. I do want to also give credit to my colleague, Carrie Sapalo. Carrie himself is blind, and he's a scientist. He's a chemist by training. So in all of these experiences as well, and all of the research that we've done together, like I said, this is a multi-year effort, and I was just showcasing a couple of the examples that we came up immediately pre-COVID, as Bob had noted, to acknowledge 2020 here. But essentially, these are the realities that exist in our classrooms, and anybody who's ever spent time in the classrooms working with the students knows that when you work with students with disabilities, you work with one student with disabilities at a time. Everybody is so diverse, and we really call attention to these individualized needs. And this example with dual media came up several times, as I'm working with students across the states, both for, our foundational research that we conduct, as well as research that we do with in supporting our clients. And these profiles where accessibility doesn't necessarily fit in these very neat boxes all the time, they're very common. And as Melissa noted, partnering with your stakeholders, any classroom teacher knows this. And so working with the stakeholders, working with students, this is where we really get to call attention to these complexities and these nuances. And perhaps if we look at designing to those nuances and those complexities first, perhaps we may be able to have a more accessible version of an item that meets greater accessibility needs across all students who are taking it. Again, trying to minimize the likelihood of students having to omit content that, we want to know if they can do this, but the way that it's designed at that point in time may not be accessible for them. So again, just partnering with your stakeholders and working with the students, I think, is a critical place to start. And that's where you get to unpack all of those complexities and those nuances and incorporate them in your designs. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
Well, we're at time. It's 4 o'clock Eastern, so we're going to have to wrap up now. I want to thank the other speakers, Cheryl as discussant. Also, a big thank you to NCME staff, specifically Gina, for helping this go off as flawlessly as it did. And also, if you want to contact us, you can find us in the NCME online program. All the contact information for all of us is there. And I'm pretty sure this is being recorded, so this will be available there. And there should be an opportunity for us to make our presentations available as well, if you want a copy of those. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.